and let there be light. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek King Tiger heavy tank. Since the last video update, the engine compartment is now done. Yes, it is done. All of the details have been fitted in place, the last of the functions have been mounted in place, and they have been patched into the RC system. We are going to be going over all of this information in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a bunch of cool info coming right at you. However, before I go ahead and install the ductwork permanently into the vehicle, the one thing I had to take care of and get out of the way was I had to revisit the taillight. You see, I touched upon this in a video or two ago, and basically the tank does have a functional lighting system that is controlled via the radio. It has a remote light, you hit a switch, and the lights turn on or off depending on the command given by the operator. The unit that we have here is the EastCoastArmory.com HD 3D printed German taillight set, and was modified so that it can house an LED on the inside. Well, in the last video where I touched upon this, unfortunately there was a problem where the LED packs that I ordered were a bunch of duds, and I didn't find this out until I went to patch everything in. In the video I said I was going to have to revisit that, and here we are now at this portion in the build. The LEDs that were utilized are two small micro LEDs that I picked up from Amazon.com. The link is listed in the description below. Unlike the last LED, which was a large standard size LED, this one here utilizes two small, very bright light LEDs, and I stagger them in the, or I should say on the two opposite ends here of the clear tubing. The LEDs just drop directly into place, and what's nice is the set comes with a few different size resistors in order for you to mount them in place, which would prevent the LEDs from burning out from excessive voltage. The LED was, or I should say the resistors were added, and then the unit was patched into the remainder of the power supply. Also patched in was the headlight, and the headlight and the taillight are both connected to the same circuit, so you hit the switch and they both turn on in unison. The tank is currently powered on, and if I hit the appropriate channel on the radio, you should clearly see the taillight now in fully operation. If I hit the switch in the reverse direction, the light simply turns off. Like I stated before, the exact same system is patched into the bow headlight, which should look something like this. So here you can see the light on. Currently there's a little bit of masking tape on the inner portion here of the Bosch light because obviously to protect the lens on the inside from being oversprayed, but even with the mask in place you can clearly see the light on the inside being functional. And again, it just simply turns off with a flick of a switch. To patch in the electronics and actually make them work on command, I utilize this little magical device that we have here. And I gotta say, this thing is absolutely awesome, amazing. I cannot recommend this enough, specifically if you want to put extra functions in your RC models. Not just on this 1/6 scale model over here, but also in any smaller scale project that you may or may not be working on. In the past, for me to go ahead and achieve this type of system here, I would have to go through this advanced, elaborate type, Rube Goldberg design type mechanism where we have a servo, a set of impact switches, and I go ahead and have to hook up the wires accordingly depending on the function that I'm trying to get activating. In many of my older videos, I talk about this in a little bit more depth, and basically the system does work. It's an analog system, and it's great and all. However, it has some drawbacks. First is added complexity. It is a mechanical device that needs to be individually hand-assembled, made, and designed, not to mention fabricated, just to, fit into the function setting, which of course takes a bunch of time. The other issue is that the size of the device is quite large, and in a RC model, free space is a luxury that gets gobbled up very quickly. Yes, even a giant Armortek King Tiger like this included. We've seen the inside of this thing so far. It looks like an ungainly mess that needs to be cleaned up, so any free space is going to be greatly appreciated. Well, fortunately with this little device here, it solves all of those problems. First is simplicity. This thing is ridiculous. ridiculously easy to patch in. It's ready to go out of the box. No modifications need to be made to this unit whatsoever. The unit does have several options available on how to configure it to do certain things. However, if you're just looking for a simple on and off type setting like I'm using over here, you just roll with the out-of-the-box setting and you're really good to go. The hookups are also ludicrously easy to follow. You have a plug over here that patches into your radio receiver, and you have these two red wires. These here intersect the power wires that are found on the light bulb. Of course, they're both red, so the one that you patch into is the positive line. You wire it the same way as you would basically any other mechanical switch, but it's just done with this little electronic device here. Once the unit's patched in, it connects to the RC system, and you are good to go. It is a hugely easy setup to do, and within about 5 or 10 minutes or so, you're going to be off to the road running. One other thing, like I touched upon before, is size. The other devices utilize a servo, and even with the smallest servo you have, you're still going to get a unit that's about, this tall and about that wide. Not too large in a 1/6 scale tank type setting, but if you're doing something in 1/16 or in another type of format, it's going to be a problem. Even in 1/6 scale, it tends to be something that uses up free space. With this unit over here, as you can see, in comparison to my thumb, this thing is really, really tiny, which makes it super convenient and easy to tuck away into your model without taking any notable free space whatsoever. These units here are also really affordable. I have a link in the description below to either an Amazon or an eBay link, depending on exactly where I found this thing and who exactly has them at the time of filming of this video. But rest assured, if you're looking for one of these, the link is listed below. I've stockpiled on a bunch of these little devices, and undoubtedly you will be seeing them as I go ahead and do other radio control builds in the future, specifically these 1/6 scale ones. With the taillight and the headlight systems now fully operational and out of the way, the next and final thing to secure onto these sponson areas are the functional flappers. The flapper ducts, I've went into way more detail on how they work and why they work in a certain way in previous update videos, and I recommend checking those out if you're stumbling into this video for the first time. Basically, these systems work where they're these articulating flaps that are used to restrict airflow into the radiators to start the engine on a cold day. On the model over here, these functions were built into them, and in order to complete the installation, of course, they need to be hooked up to a servo. The servo is attached via a long mechanical linkage, and once everything is installed in place, the unit should be able to work in unison. To get the linkage to work, in the past I would have utilized a ball and socket type system. However, for these ones here, I went with an alternative method, which should be just as effective. For the system that I went with this build, you can see an example right over here. So rather than the ball and socket type linkage, I went with a eye hook and also a corresponding eye bent into this length of brass rod. As you can see, it's really, really rudimentary on how it works, and once it's hooked up, it should perform the task just fine. The other end over here is going to have a servo connection point that's going to be soldered in place, and this is going to be done after the units are secured in the vehicle, just so I have everything cut to the appropriate length. But as you can see, the eye socket does a really good job in the units being able to articulate. Also, with this design, there's no risk of the units ever popping out for one reason or another, and once they are patched in, they should be good to go. On these two examples over here, you notice I had to go ahead and have an extender added to the clevis in order to clear some of the other sections found on the sponson. These two ducts are for the two rearmost flappers that are found under the last of the engine, or I should say the grillwork sections, and because of their location, I need to clear the radiator, and that's why I went ahead and fabricated this little extender section that we have here. These extenders are just fabricated out of sections of resin that I turned to shape, and I went ahead and secured them to the clevis arm that we have here. I already test fitted the unit inside the tank, and it clears the radiator absolutely perfectly. Also, because of the way these units are hooked up in place with the eyelet, this means they're really articulated, so getting them into those tight confines and having them work around all the equipment that's currently fitted in place is going to be more easily done compared to some other alternatives. So from here, the next thing to do is, you guessed it, fit them onto the tank's interior. But one thing I do want to mention before I go ahead and do that is that on this section over here, you'll see that I went ahead and glued on 3 small washers. The purpose of the washers is that this gives a standoff, so when the unit gets cemented, or I should say siliconed in place, the silicone doesn't inhibit the fasteners that are located in this sections over here. If we look at, for instance, this example, you can see the 3 fasteners that were used to pin everything together, and they do, of course, protrude from the side. Obviously, this is going to lead to some problems when securing to the side of the firewall, because it will, one, stick out because it's going to rest on top of those points and won't sit flush, and also the silicone could inhibit the units, which are going to be needed for the units to pivot properly. So what I'm doing on these examples is I'm gluing 3 washers to these sections over here, which completely conceal the heads of the fasteners, and it gives a new standoff point for the unit to be secured in place with the silicone. This modification is going to be made to all 3 of these examples, and once the super glue sets, I can then finally install them in place, and then continue with the remainder of the installation by hooking them up to the servo. As what I mentioned in the previous video, the very last thing that I need to do in order to finish up the engine compartment is complete the remainder of the engine compartment plumbing. This would include the various cooling tubes that need to enter and wrap around the engine compartment to go through the various cooling systems that are found on the King Tiger. To flush out all of these components, here you can see the 3D printed parts that are on the table. These components here consist of a number of the fittings that are going to be used for all of what I just mentioned. 3D printed from a vendor that I have, and these pieces though are just rough prototypes. The actual production ones are going to be supplied with the inserts that I touched upon in the previous video. But here you get to see exactly what the parts look like before they're final production form. So here we have these 2 intakes. These are ductwork that connect the cooling system to the exhaust manifolds that are found on the Maybach engine. On the version with the Cyclone air filtration system, the engine exhausts have this coolant shroud on them. In order to pump cool air in to preserve or extend the life on the exhaust manifolds, this is done by ducting air from the cooling fans into the exhaust manifold system, controlling its temperature, somewhat. The components that we see here consist of 2 pieces. This is the top section, and this is going to plug into this area right over here on the insert that I made in the last video. And this piece here is an adapter that's going to glue onto the ECA section that's present on the Maybach engine. These 2 cylinder sections here are going to be used to connect rubber tubing that's going to facilitate the remainder of the detailing. Of course, more on that is going to come after the unit gets installed and mounted in place. The remainder of the fittings consists of these plumbing fittings that we have here. These are going to be positioned in various locations on the engine compartment, and basically we have the curved elbow section and the detailing here for the coupler. The coupler is nothing more than a tube with these hose clamps that you see on the top, and all these details are present with the printing, including the small little fasteners that are found on the clamps themselves. The same type of fitting is, or I should say the same type of setup with the clamps are found on all the other printed sections that we have here, like this T-fitting. I already showed the elbow, and also some straight fittings. All of these components here are intended for use with a 1/4 of an inch aluminum rod. The rod is currently not on the table, obviously, at this point, but it's going to be bent, cut to shape, and then painted towards the latter half of the video, and then you really get to see how it looks like once everything is fitted in place. The other thing to mention is this section that we have over here. This is not supplied with this set. This one was supplied with the fuel tanks that I touched upon in the previous video, and what you see here are just the remainder of the plumbing fittings required to finalize and flesh out that piece. Of course, all of these sections here are going to go through their paint and weathering procedure as soon as I'm done filming this take. So here's the engine compartment getting its coolant tubes fitted in place. The tubes are fabricated out of a 1/4 of an inch aluminum rod, as I touched upon before. The reason why I like to use solid rod for this as opposed to hollow tubing is because it's really hard to bend tubing in this manner and have it come out without any kinks. The solid material is much easier to bend. It adds a little bit more weight compared to the tubing. However, it's not like these components are functional or anything, and they're purely used for detailing. Also, because they are aluminum, the extra weight is really negligible. On top of that, we are talking on a 500-pound tank, so, you know, a couple ounces of extra weight isn't really going to break the bank. Those 3D printed fittings really do cut down a bunch on the time, and the units just plug into place once everything is bent to the appropriate shape. From this point here, this setup is all done. I could go ahead, get it into paint and weathering. The next thing to focus on are the remainder of the coolant tubes, because there are still more plumbing to add to this section here, not to mention a few of the other gizmos that still need to be fabricated, which I'll be taking care of that right now. And here are those same components now, fully painted and weathered, and at this point here, they're ready for final installation. So, in addition to the other pieces that I touched upon before, some other accessories are some extra pieces of plumbing that have been bent and formed to shape. On the main engine pieces over here, these are comprised of the 1/4-inch aluminum rod that I was touching upon before, and you can also see how the fittings plug into place. With the pieces fully painted, you get to see exactly how nice everything looks, and it does have a very realistic look to it. In order to paint the pieces, the center portion would be rubber. You know, it's basically like rubber hose clamps that we still see today on things like ductwork and other sorts of plumbing fittings. And the hose clamps are, again, just standard metal hose clamps, and so to paint them, use flat black for the rubber sections, or to me a rubber black, and for the silver section, you just paint them with a paintbrush in, well, silver and aluminum. And once everything's fully dry, it really does have a very nice realistic look to it. Aside from that, you can also see the 2 drive shafts that we have right here, and the other one's right over there. These here are what will connect the tower portion of the Maybach HL230 to the actual fan clutches, or they're not really clutches, it's actually to the gearbox that's found inside of the fan housing. And like I stated before, on the real Tiger, the spinning of this motion over here is actually what turns the fans, and they're all powered by the center portion of the engine. The components are made out of cast resin. These have been in production for a number of years now, and probably as old as the ECA Maybach engine itself. I do eventually want to phase these out. The resin molds are getting kind of out there in their age and with the numbers of casting that they have, and it's just something that they're a little bit tedious to cast, and again, it would be really beneficial if I was just to replace these altogether with 3D printed counterparts, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless, you can see that the pieces are somewhat functional. However, obviously this is a static engine, so the piece is just going to be glued in place. I will say that the articulating nature of these pieces over here make it really, or I should say, it simplifies the installation, because you can get around certain things inside the engine compartment much along the lines of the real one. So with all of these done, and with the wash that's been applied basically dry, we can finally jump into the installation. And here are the flapper ducts now fitted permanently to the vehicle. These are attached to the model with the use of silicone for the same reasons I touched upon in the last video, pertaining to the fans themselves, as well as also the rear fuel tanks. In addition to being secured in place, of course, the units are patched in and hooked up mechanically to the servo, which will actually facilitate the animations. Of course, the exact same thing is done to the opposite side, and both of the servos are hooked up at this time and are fully functional, which I'm going to show momentarily. One thing about the servo, or I should say one thing about the flap animation, is that they need to work in a certain way. When I first designed this system about 10 years ago on my King Tiger, the system was patched in so that the 2 blades, or I should say the blades on either side, worked in this type of manner where they're both going in the same direction. On the real vehicle, this is actually incorrect, and they actually work opposing one another like this, again, to constrict the airflow. When I designed the unit at first, I was trying to figure out how to exactly go about that with the servo and how to hook up the linkages, so it was more expedient at the time to go ahead and hook it up in the other configuration. The other build, however, of course I'm never going to change that, it's perfectly fine as is, but it is something that I wanted to touch upon, because after I completed that model, over the next few years, I always had the envision of going ahead and redesigning a system to make it a little bit more prototypical. The one that I built on my tank was really more or less a proof of concept, and it actually worked quite well, obviously. Well, on the production units over here, I was able to figure out how to actually do it, and it just took a little bit of orientation on the behalf of the servo hookup. Hopefully, with the camera angle readjusted and with the lighting situation that I have, you should be able to see the servo in better light. The two brass push rods that I touched upon before, you can see are now hooked up to clevises that are on the actual servo star, which was cut into a T-type format just so that it doesn't inhibit the throw. In order to do this, one rod is hooked up to one side of the servo while the other is hooked up to the one on the opposite side. This will have the effect of when the servo pivots, one will be pulling towards and the other will be pushing away. It is this type of motion is what you will need in order to get the flaps to work in the appropriate directions. Because of this, in one motion of the servo, both units will move opposing one another as opposed to with one another like I did on my first proof of concept. Hopefully with the camera readjusted and with the flashlight pointing on the inside over here, you get to see the animation in, well, lack of a better term, better light. If I pan the camera to the reverse side, you get to see what that operation looks like, also in better detail. And with that, the last of the extra functions have been added to the vehicle. So, with these units now fully functional and out of the way, the next thing to focus on was the remainder of the engine compartment details. And of course, since the last video update, the remainder of the engine compartment plumbing and fittings have been mounted in place. These are all the same features that I showed earlier on the table, but here of course you get to see what they look like now mounted to the vehicle. In concept, the function is similar to the Tiger One, and if anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about, I really recommend pausing this video here and tuning into one of my Tiger One engine bay interior videos, because there I go into all of the nitty-gritty on exactly how the system works. But basically, in a nutshell, on the Tiger One, the coolant would flow into from the engine compartment out of the engine into the top portion of the radiator, emerge from the bottom portion, swing around to the opposite side into the top, and then the bottom portion would go around again and enter back into the engine, creating a cycle for the coolant to flow, get hot, cool down, and then get pumped back in again. Of course, this was all done to keep the engine from overheating. On the King Tiger and the Panther, by the way, is basically the same way. It's the same system, but it's done a little bit differently. First, as opposed to two very large radiators, the King Tiger facilitates this with the use of 4 smaller ones. The hot fluid would enter into one of the units, like right over here. Then it would cool down and be pumped through the bottom into the other radiator that we have over here, because again, on the bottom portion of these ducts there's a bunch of tubes, which are discussed in another video update. And then from here it would emerge, run across to the opposite side, and then pump its way back into the engine in this manner. In addition to that, on the 2 rear sides, or rear portions here of the Maybach, we have 2 other coolant tubes, and on the Tiger One they would both come up and run this way across the engine into 2 of these really large elbows found on the cooling system, and that would patch in. On the King Tiger over here, it's done a little bit different, where they both emerge from this section. They would run along this area over here, along the wall here of the engine compartment, go around this area with this distinctive little hump, bend around right before the fuel tank, and then re-enter into these 2 sections, or 2 small fittings here found on the coolant reservoir. Back to the details that were added, those small little pipe fittings that I mentioned earlier really do give the engine compartment quite a bit of extra life to it, and it really does make it look all that much more realistic as opposed to just having the units without these little fittings in place. It really does bring a lot more life to the model as opposed to leaving them absent. And all of this should definitely be appreciated once the rear deck area is fully completed and you get to open up the engine hatch once that is fitted in place. The only thing that's left to do now in the engine compartment is to permanently secure the Cyclone air filter boxes in their appropriate location. Unlike the Tiger 1, where these units are designed to be removable so you get to appreciate the carburetor detailing underneath, on the King Tiger here that's not going to be possible because of with the way the rear engine lid section is designed. Unlike the Tiger 1, where the air filters can actually be plucked out of the engine compartment without having to do any sort of extra removal work, on the King Tiger here, that's a little bit of a different story. With the way that engine hatch is designed, the Cyclone system basically fills up the entire section over here, so you're not going to be able to just simply lift these units out. So securing them permanently in place is going to be the way to go. And by the way, this is also why the Germans themselves had the design where by removing a series of fasteners, that entire center plate gets to be removed, just so you can get access to basically what I just mentioned over here, the whole entire engine compartment uninhibited. As for sealing up the remainder of this rear deck area over here, this is going to be discussed in the next video update, which should be dropping probably within a week or so after this one, because of some modifications I'm going to have to make to the kit itself. Trying to install this panel here into this section with the kit system is not going to be possible anymore, so some clever redesign work is going to be done. But fear not, I already know exactly how to do it, and that's going to be the topic of the next video. Needless to say, the addition of those final two functions that I mentioned earlier, and with the addition of the engine compartment details, finishes this entire area off on the model. At this point here, I can seal this bad boy up, which is really the last bit of detailing or last bit of this build that's preventing it from heading off into paint. So obviously this is some really, really important news. As I showed in the last video, I do have quite a bit of the replacement details on hand, or I should say I have all of the replacement details on hand in order to fully flesh this area out. And I'm also going to be making some modifications to some of the kit components themselves in order to adapt them to fit into this configuration now. But of course, all this information is to come in the next project update video. And I guess this is a perfect place to sign off on this project update video for the 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek King Tiger heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the ECA channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted all the way since the project started, along with the other smaller scale builds that have been mentioned on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.